necessarily follow up the next milestone or the milestone after with improvements on that MVC. So I was wondering, what do you think about how long an iteration cycle should be if we're working really hard to get that first change out there? How should we be following up with new issues so that we're continually adding value?
Yeah, so you're totally right that happens. And I think it's a feature, not a bug, as in, if you plan like, hey, let's spend the next 3 iterations working on this feature, that you're not listening to the feedback that's coming in. So most of the time, probably you should ship that first thing, and then you should hear from customers like, what is next? And then sometimes it's like, wow, this was amazing, but I'm missing so much, and can you please add to it? Great, you'll plan that. Sometimes, and that's the ones we probably forget about, is no one's really interested. We've had so many of those. ChatOps, like I thought ChatOps is the best thing in the world, and I thought it made total sense, and almost nobody is using it. Now, there's other problems there where there's not dog fooding and things like that, but we tend to forget about the times we made something and then it just didn't get any traction. So if you say, hey, we're going to make iteration 1, 2, and 3 all subsequent without any pauses in between, you're probably not listening to the market. Now, that might be because you already know, and it could be sometimes you just know. Compliance, we know it's going to be really good for our customers, and it's a really monetizable feature. So yeah, we can just go full speed ahead. But many times you don't know, and it's probably best to ship it, do something else, and do something else, assuming there's no switching costs. Of course, there's sometimes if you start working on something else that there's switching costs involved. But I think with our monthly releases, I think it's okay. I think there's not super high switching costs as long as you don't change the sprint on the work. So another example is Service Desk. We shipped that really minimal. Nobody cared. And then 1-2 years later, suddenly a lot of customers are using it, appreciating it. And it's like, wow, that's a really minimal feature. Why can't I send a confidential message that doesn't go back to the person who made it? Oh, yeah, we get it. Yeah, that should have been there from the start. It's just that we shipped a minimal thing and we waited until there was traction. And there's now traction, and I hope we'll add that soon. So the answer is do it based on feedback. And probably in most circumstances, it doesn't make sense to keep working on the same thing a couple of releases after each other.
That's helpful, as it does sometimes feel like we are taking a really long time to build new things after we release a minimal piece. And I think you're right. It's based on the appetite to consume that feature. And if you're validating with customers, then yeah, it will take longer. That was super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. And of course, it takes a lot of time to fix that individual feature, but that's also because we have a ton of scope and we need to fix the other things that we're building. Wayne, you want to verbalize your question?
Sure. So any recommendations how the defend stage could have broken up the feature to export vulnerabilities to a CSV file into smaller pieces and do it more iteratively? Background is it was accomplished via 2 MRs, one for the back end and one for the front end, and had multiple steps to the functionality. User clicks the download button, then the front end tells the back end to initiate export. Back end creates the export storage. The back end creates the background job. When the job completes, the back end marks the export as complete. The front end's in polling and then knows that the file is ready to be downloaded. Front end then sends the file to the browser so the user can download. And later the back end deletes the file after it's more than 24 hours old. So we did this with basically one relatively large MR for the back end and one smaller one for the front end. So what are your thoughts on how we could have broken this out into separate MRs?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think that what these downloads, one of the big problems always is that that it takes a while to generate the download and that you kind of need to get back to the user somehow. from what I'm hearing, I think that right now that's handled through the interface. Would it have been easier to email it to the user so that there's no time constraint? And I know that wouldn't have been an option for many people who say, look, we don't want it over an encrypted email and things like that. But would that have made it easier to do the initial MVC?
It would have, and we decided specifically to not do that for that very reason, is that the data is relatively proprietary, and we were thinking customers didn't want it sent over an unencrypted method, such as email, but instead download it via HTTPS.
That makes sense. Then that's probably not a good idea, but if email would have been simpler, we could have solved the encryption problem of email by putting it in an encrypted format in the email. That way we'd have still not had the interface problem, but we would have alleviated the security concerns. I don't think that's practical because kind of encoding emails and stuff like that, it gets gnarly quickly. But you said that the backend was the biggest lift, not the front end. So why was the backend the biggest lift? Why do you think that was?
I think it was partially that both developers are relatively new. I've been at GitLab for 4 to 6 weeks, and they hadn't gone through the iteration training yet. I don't think it actually existed when they first started, but they're doing it now. And it was larger rather than being broken out because they had the non-GitLab way of thinking about how to break things up, where things had to be in really good shape before you merge, rather than good enough shape where it doesn't break something for the customer and provide some value, but it doesn't need to be fully complete. So an example, step H, backend deletes a file after it's more than 24 hours old. That could have been done perhaps in a separate MR. Perhaps we have the download button there and the user can click it, but it doesn't do anything yet, right? Where we disconnect those where we're trying to do them both together. I think some of those things may have made, breaking it up with that kind of expectation may have been better in hindsight.
Yeah, maybe there's also a way to reduce scope. Like looking at the code, it looks like we export all our different types of vulnerabilities. Would there have been a subset that would have been easier to work on? Like only findings or scanning, or I don't know.
Yeah, it might have been. That might have helped. We did release it without trying to polish it, which is good. I didn't put the details in there. So for example, the file name didn't have .csv on the end. And we decided that's okay. And we've since changed that, but there were iterative changes done after the initial release, which were good. So that when it's clicked on, it automatically opens up in whatever spreadsheet reader is default for the user, which is good. We had a number of small changes like that came after the initial stuff. So cool. Well, thanks for the feedback.
Yeah. One thing that is, look, I'm looking at the code and I'm by no means an expert, but there's a database table and everything for this. Why is that? Was that necessary in the first step? Probably it was. I just want to get a bit more background.
I think the database table was done for a place to store the export while it was being created, I believe.
Yeah, but aren't we also storing a CSV file anyway?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll pass it on to the developer that developed it, who couldn't make it today, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. And of course, like I want this to be encouragement, and it's not a code review or anything. Okay,
Sure,
cool.
Sure.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Anybody else who wants to look at something? Cool. Bradley, could you reach Jensen or Sam on short notice?
I sent a message to Jensen. I think Sam White is already on this call, but I'm not sure which Sam you're referring to. Sorry.
No, Sam Ossack. Cool. Then if nobody else has a question, then that's it for now. Thanks for joining and good luck with iterating.